I found my will in a manila folder last fall, behind the insurance papers. It was dated March 14th, 2008. My wife Eleanor was still listed as primary beneficiary. She's been dead for 6 years. My 3 children were listed as equal thirds. One of them lives 40 minutes away and visited once last year. One of them I've spoken to 4 times in 12 months. The document had no idea. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, not angry, just looking at the gap between what that paper said my life was and what my life actually was. Then I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. I'm 83, and what I did next is the most honest thing I've done in years. I want to tell you what it was, and why you should do it too. Today, not when you get around to it. I found my will in a manila folder behind the insurance papers. March 14th, 2008. 15 years old. I hadn't looked at it since the lawyer handed it to me, and I'd signed where she pointed and driven home and put it in the filing cabinet under E for estate. I sat down at the kitchen table and I read it. Eleanor Louise Marsh, primary beneficiary. My wife, dead for 6 years. I kept reading. David Allen Marsh, Patricia Ann Marsh, Gregory Scott Marsh. Children, equal thirds of the remainder. The house on Birch Street, the accounts, the tools in the garage that I spent 40 years collecting, every one of them with a name in my head for who should get it. That's what I'd thought when I bought each one. This one's for David. This one for Gregory when he builds his first deck. I sat there and I read this document about a family, a specific family that gathered at Thanksgiving, that called on birthdays and meant it, that had children who called me grandpa and visited in the summer and asked to see how I did things. A family where my wife was still the center of everything, where her name made sense at the top of a legal document, because she was the first person the world would want to know about if something happened to me. That family doesn't exist anymore. Not the way this document describes it. Eleanor has been gone since 2017. David is in Denver. I have met his children, my grandchildren, 4 times. Patricia sends gift cards at Christmas and a text on my birthday that says, "Thinking of you, Dad. Hope you're well." And I write back, "Thank you, sweetheart." And that is the full content of our relationship for most of the year. Gregory comes more than the others, twice last year. And when he comes, it's good, it's real. But he lives 4 hours away and has his own difficulties, and I don't hold his absence against him. The will didn't know any of this. The will thought it was 2008. I want to be precise about something before I go further. I am not angry at my children. I want to say that plainly, because what I'm about to tell you will sound like anger if you're not listening carefully, and it isn't. My children are not bad people. David built a life in Colorado with a wife and a job and demands that are real. Patricia has her own history with me. Things from when they were young that I did not handle well, distances I created that she eventually just accepted. Gregory is present when he can be, but I am 83 years old, and I had a health scare last fall that reminded me, in the specific and clarifying way that health scares do, that the distance between now and the end is shorter than it used to be. And in that clarity, I went looking for my will, and I found a document written for a version of my life that ended some years ago, and I had to decide what to do with that. My name is Leonard. I spent 38 years as a building contractor. Houses, residential, the kind of work where you are inside someone's life at its most basic level. You are building the place where they will argue and make up and raise children and get old. I liked that. I liked understanding how things are built and what makes them hold. I married Eleanor in 1973, and we built a life the way I built houses, carefully, with good materials, checking the foundation before anything else. When Eleanor died, the foundation changed. I didn't build anything new on top of the change. I just kept living in the old structure and pretending the ground was the same. The will was part of that. Keeping it unchanged was a way of not admitting that the family it described had quietly become something else. My neighbor Bill is 79. We have been neighbors for 22 years, and we talk over the fence most mornings. And we have the kind of friendship that doesn't require much maintenance because it's never been tested by anything significant. Bill's kids are in a similar situation to mine. One nearby, two gone. He hasn't updated his will in 11 years. I know this because I asked him about it after the health scare, after I'd found mine. He said, "Why would I? They'll get it when I go. That's how it works." I said, "Does the will reflect your actual life?" He said, "It reflects what I want my life to be." I've thought about that a lot. There's something almost admirable in it. Holding a document like a statement of intention, a declaration about the family you're still trying to have. But Bill is getting angrier every year. The gap between the will and the calendar is widening, and he's filling it with resentment, not with action. He's waiting for something the document promises, but nobody's delivering. I decided I didn't want to wait. David is 55. He is a project manager for a tech company in Denver, and he is genuinely good at his work and genuinely busy in ways that I believe are real. We talk on the phone about 4 times a year, Christmas, my birthday, his birthday, and occasionally when something happens that one of us feels the other should know about. The calls last between 15 and 30 minutes. They are not unpleasant. We cover the basics. We don't argue. We don't say anything that costs either of us anything. We say, "I love you, Dad," and "I love you too, son," and we hang up, and another few months pass. I have met his youngest daughter, Emma, twice. She is 9 years old. She called me Grandpa Leonard the first time she met me, and I had to leave the room for a minute because it was more than I expected. The will left David an equal third of everything, not because of our relationship as it currently exists, a cordial semi-annual phone call and a granddaughter I've met twice, but because of who he was in 2008 and who I believed he'd remain, and what I assumed a father leaves a son. Patricia is 51. She lives 40 minutes away. I want you to sit with that. 40 minutes. She visited once in 2023. She visited once in 2022. In 2021, she came twice. Once because Gregory was visiting at the same time, and the logistics made it easier. She sends gift cards. She texts on occasions. The texts are warm in a way that has been carefully calibrated to maintain a connection without requiring her to be physically in a room with me. And I understand this because the distance between us was something I had a hand in building when she was younger, when I was a man who did not know how to be soft with a daughter. And she has decided, I think reasonably, that the appropriate level of contact is the one she currently maintains. I hold no grudge. But 40 minutes. The will left her an equal third. Sandra is not my daughter. Sandra is the daughter of my neighbor on the other side, Grace, who moved to assisted living in 2021. Sandra was coming to check on her mother's house every week and started checking on me at the same time. First because I was her mother's neighbor, and then, I think, because she decided I was worth checking on for my own sake. In November of 2022, I had a rough week. A virus, nothing serious, but I was 81 and alone, and it knocked me down harder than I expected. On a Tuesday afternoon, there was a knock at the door, and it was Sandra with a container of chicken soup. She left it on the porch with a note that said, "Heard you weren't feeling well. No need to call back." I stood in the doorway and read that note 3 times. No need to call back. Not, I expect something in return for this. Not, now you owe me a phone call. Just, here, because you needed it and I don't need anything back. Sandra has driven me to 2 medical appointments when I couldn't drive myself. She has sat with me for an afternoon when I got a piece of news I didn't know how to hold, alone. She is not my blood. She is not in my will. Or she wasn't. Until last January. I went to see my lawyer in January of 2023. I told her I wanted to update the document. She asked if there had been a change in family circumstances. I said, not recently, but I've been looking at it honestly for the first time in 15 years, and it doesn't match my life. She didn't blink. She's seen everything. We went through it. I reduced David's share. I reduced Patricia's share. I left Gregory his third. He shows up, he tries, geography is real. I added Sandra. I left something to the local library where I've spent more Sunday afternoons than I can count, and where nobody has ever let me down. I added a letter, not legally binding, just a letter to go with the document, to be read after, that explained my reasoning in plain language. Not accusatory, not punishing, just true. The last line of the letter said, I leave this to the people who showed up. Not because showing up earns anything, but because a life should end honestly. And this is what my life, honestly, looked like. I drove to the post office and mailed the envelope to my lawyer's office, and sat in the car afterward for a while. Not guilty, not triumphant, clear. I felt clear for the first time in years about exactly what my relationships were, who was in them, and what I was going to do with the time I had left. 3 weeks later, David called, not at Christmas, not on a birthday, a Tuesday. He said he'd been thinking about me and wanted to see how I was doing. I don't know if it's connected. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I just picked up the phone and talked to my son for an hour, the longest we'd talked in years. And when we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt with him in a long time. Present. I felt present. Here is what I want to tell you, and I want to say it directly. Your will is a document about your life as you believe it to be. Most people write it once, At some point in their 50s or 60s, when a lawyer or a spouse finally persuades them to, and then they put it in a folder, and they never look at it again. Which means most people are carrying around a legal description of a family, a life, a set of relationships that may have changed entirely since the day they signed it. It's not a small thing. A will is not a formality. A will is a declaration about who matters, about who you trust, about who you believe has been present in your life and who deserves to receive what you spent your life building. When you don't update it, you are making a choice. You are saying that the person who mattered in 2009 is the same person who matters now, regardless of what the last 15 years actually looked like. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes the relationships have held and the document still describes reality, and you can put it back in the folder and be at peace. But sometimes, often, it isn't true, and the gap between what the will says and what the calendar says is one of the most clarifying, uncomfortable, necessary things you can look at. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is about punishment, about using the will as a weapon, dangling the inheritance to get the visits, rewriting it to get revenge for the neglect. I understand why it reads that way. The title I chose was designed to make you think that. Because if I'd said, contemplate your mortality honestly today, you might have skipped this. But that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about honesty. I'm talking about the specific and uncomfortable act of looking at a document that was supposed to describe your most important relationships and asking, quietly, whether it still does. Because here's what that act does, if you do it honestly. It forces you to name who is actually in your life, not who you wish were in your life, not who you're holding a place for in case they come back, who is actually there, who called last month, who came when you were sick, who sat with you through something difficult, who has, by the simple and irreducible act of showing up, earned the right to be described as someone you trust. That list might be shorter than you expected. It might include people you didn't expect. It might include someone who isn't family at all, and that is not a tragedy. That is information. That is your life telling you something true about itself. Bill keeps his unchanged because changing it would mean admitting the gap. I understand that. The gap is painful. But the gap doesn't close because you don't look at it. It closes, if it closes, because you see it clearly and you decide what to do. Maybe what you do is reach out to your David or your Patricia and say, I've been thinking about us and I want it to be different. Maybe what you do is let go of the resentment that comes from expecting a relationship your will describes, but your phone doesn't deliver. Either way, you have to see it first. Here is what I want you to do today. Find your will, not tomorrow, today, while this is still in your mind. Sit down with it somewhere quiet and read it the way I read mine, as if someone else wrote it, about people you're meeting for the first time. Ask yourself, does this document describe my actual life? Does the person listed as most important actually act like the most important person? Does the division of what I've built reflect who has actually been building something with me in these last years? If the answer is yes, put it back. Good. You have what a lot of people don't. If the answer is no, and I suspect for many of you reading this, the answer is at least partially no, then you have two things to do. First, make an appointment with a lawyer and update the document so it tells the truth. Not to punish, to be honest. An honest will is not an angry will. It is just a document that describes your actual life, which is what a will is supposed to be. Second, look at the gap and decide if you want to close it. Not by waiting, not by hoping the kids start calling more because they sense something is different. By calling them, by saying, "I've been thinking about us. I want more of a relationship than we've been having. Can we try?" Some of them will say yes, some won't. But you'll know, and knowing is better than keeping a 15-year-old document in a filing cabinet and calling it hope. I'm 83. I updated my will, I wrote my letter, I mailed it to my lawyer, and 3 weeks later, my son called on a Tuesday for no reason at all. I don't know what that means, but I know I felt present for it. Tell me in the comments, when did you last read your will, and does it still describe your life?